I wanted to talk today about the stages of putting together legislation. The central role of the legislative bill drafter is obviously putting together legislation. And according to the program in the graduate diploma in legislative drafting at Athabasca University in Alberta, Canada, there are four main stages in putting together legislation: forming the policy, initiating the legislation, instructing legislative council, and preparing the legislative text. And there are obviously some very important aspects of each of these four stages that legislators and legislative staff should be aware of. So let's go through the four stages. Stage one, again, is forming the policy. And in this first stage, there are two component parts: policy appraisal and developing policy options. For purposes of appraising the policy proposal, there are basically three subparts: establishing your policy objectives, assessing your policy options, and then selecting your preferred option. And for purposes of developing the policy options, the critical issue really is taking the policy that makes most sense and is easily turned into an operational scheme. Stage two is initiating the legislation. And in this second stage, the client, the legislator, decides that they are going to initiate legislation. And they've decided on a policy option to propose. And so now the legislator has decided to initiate the drafting of the legislation. And whether the legislator and his or her staff has taken a crack at drafting legislative language or not, there's the policy that's been decided, and a decision has obviously been made to move forward. Now, stage three is instructing the legislative council. And in this third stage, the client legislator has to provide drafting instructions to the Office of Legislative Counsel and the attorneys there. This includes giving clear instructions about what the legislator wants to see in the bill, as well as analyzing the proposal. And that step includes both the client and the bill drafter discussing it, and then formulating the statutory scheme. And while the bill drafter is going to give advice to the client, obviously the decision on key components of that statute is going to be left up to the client legislator. And then stage four is preparing the legislative text. And in this fourth stage, the bill drafter basically puts together an outline of the statutory scheme, composes the text of the proposed legislation, and scrutinizes their own work to ensure compliance with applicable drafting rules, as well as the instructions that they've received from their client legislator. So in examining the details of these four stages, we really look at the role of the legislative council in this case. And there's been a tremendous amount written about how policy is made. And generally, of course, the bill drafter's role is not to formulate the policy, but instead to transform the legislator's proposed policy into actual legislation. Um, Others sometimes argue that a more effective approach is actually to bring the legislative council, the attorneys, into that very first stage when the policy is actually being determined. In this manner, the bill drafter can understand precisely what the client legislator is contemplating. It would enable the bill drafter to gain a fuller understanding of the policy objectives of the client legislator and the desired approach to be taken. And that would be very helpful if the bill drafter is involved in the very early stages of formulating the policy. The main goal of formulating the policy, of course, is to select your preferred policy approach. And here, the client legislator often compares and contrasts different policy options to decide which one is the best one and why they're going to pursue a particular one. They might consult with interested parties, the executive branch, interest groups, the regulated community, etc. After that phase is usually when the client legislator informs the legislative council. But if the bill drafter is involved during those earlier policy discussions, then the bill drafting instructions will clearly be known by both the client legislator as well as the bill drafter. And when that involvement doesn't occur, then legislative counsel has to be provided with very clear drafting instructions and maybe a lot of the information that's already been discussed in those early formulation stages. The legislative counsel, the bill drafter, might then have minor or even significant questions in order to draft the legislation in the manner desired by the client legislator. Obviously, bill drafters bring tremendous experience and understanding about the law as it exists today, how maybe analogous problems have been resolved in, say, comparable legislation. And then ultimately, in the final stage, the legislative council drafts the text of the proposed legislation, including outlining the statutory scheme and determining how this particular bill proposal fits within existing law. And then they compose the text, scrutinize it, and put together the final product for their client. In the end, a well-crafted statute is easily understandable for those who have to enforce it or interpret it or comply with it. So it's the duty of the legislative council to draft the provisions of the law to give effect to the desired policy, but it would help to bring legislative counsel in earlier in the process so that they can better understand what their client legislator is hoping to accomplish.